Erev Tov, everybody.
Erev
Great to
Tov.
be Erev Tov. Great to be back together Monday night. Hope everyone had a meaningful President's Day and good vacation for those for whom midwinter break or the week before President's Week is some kind of vacation. Um, and we're kind of in the second half of Sefer Shmot as Dr. Brachi Elitzor is going to introduce this essay, which really is a two-parter, uh, Terumah this week and Tetzava next week. So she'll at the end sort of clarify that she's um, laid out a framework, but is going to now spell it out and develop it in next week's essay. So this is a sort of an incomplete study this week, and as usual, she'll first of all she's going to circle back to the essay from Parshat Shmot and use that as a kind of roadmap to describe the Parshiot up until now, what transition we're undergoing, and what to look for in the second half of the book. So we see, really a thematic approach and kind of threads and concepts that take us all the way through the book of Shemot, key issues that we want to be paying attention to. Um, and even we'll link up a little bit with the essay on Bashalach about the genres of Bnei Israel's complaints. So these key themes kind of preoccupy her as we make our way through the book of Shemot. And without further ado, it's a long one, so I'll share my screen. Okay, this is called Hine Anochi Sholech Malach Lefanecha. Behold, I send an angel before you. Versus V'shachanti betocham, and I will dwell in their midst. And she begins. The last 5 parshiot of Sefer Shmot raise many questions concerning the intention behind the extensive detail in the command to build the Mishkan and its vessels in Parshiot Terumah and Tetzaveh, followed by a seeming repetition of the entire matter in the description of the fulfillment of the command in Parshiot Vayakel and Pekudei, and the place of Parashat Kitisa in between these two units. This is probably the most frequently asked question when we roll into Parshat Terumah is, why does the Torah spend so much time giving us all the details of the blueprints of the Mishkan over the course of Terumah and Tetzaveh, and then repeat the carrying out, the transmission of the instructions, and then repeat the construction itself in Vayakel Pekudei? Why is so much ink spilled on this? God could just say, here are the vessels, build them the way I instructed you on Har Sinai. The details don't have to be included in the Torah. In the next few shiurim, we'll try to address these questions, but first we will return to an idea that we discussed in the first shiur on Sefer Shemot. The disagreement between God and Moshe concerning the appropriate mode of leadership of Am Yisrael. This is how she wanted to really read the conversation that happened at the burning bush, the give and take between God and Moshe. What was it really about? Was Moshe really reluctant to accept the mantle of leadership, or, as she wanted to suggest, was there a kind of a healthy give and take between God and Moshe about the way Moshe was meant to carry out God's leadership of going to Mitzrayim, taking the people out and leading them, as she's going to refresh our memory about. We examine this argument as centering on the question of whether Am Yisrael, following long years of servitude, would be able to achieve faith in God through a speaking mode of leadership, with a description of God's greatness, God's power over nature, and the destiny that God had determined for the nation. Tavdun et Elokim al har hazeh, you shall serve God upon this mountain. Moshe, right? So that's God's approach is, Moshe, I'm going to tell you all the things to say, and through the power of speech, you're going to take this people out and lead them. Moshe maintains, right? Hein lo ya'aminu li v'lo yishmu b'koli, they will not believe, they will not hear my voice. And he prefers to lead the people to faith in God by virtue of the evidence before their own eyes, through a visual, miraculous mode of leadership, in which they would behold God's greatness and power, right? Moshe's argument is for a people so downtrodden as this, so distant as this, we need signs and wonders. We need things they can see with their own eyes, not things they hear with their ears. God acquiesces to Moshe, a remarkable idea, but not one that's far into the rabbis. The rabbis talk in other places about, instances where Moshe disagreed with God and God went along with him, so to speak. So God acquiesces to Moshe, and the process of bringing Am Yisrael out of Egypt is undertaken solely through the mode of leadership symbolized by the staff, right? Not that Moshe doesn't speak, but signs and wonders become the touch point for taking Bnei Israel out of Egypt and for the beginning of their journeys after they get out. The miracles in Egypt are quite tangible, and in the description of the drowning of the Egyptian army in the Red Sea, the text emphasizes that it's the visual experience, the experience of seeing the fate of the Egyptians that leads to faith, right? As we say in Az Yashir, Vayar Yisrael et Mitzrayim et al Sfat Hayam, Israel saw Egypt dead on the shore. Vayar Yisrael Tayad Gedolah, Israel saw the great hand with which God had acted upon Egypt. The people feared God, and they believed in God and in Moshe, God's servant. During the first few months of the journey through the wilderness, the same approach continues to reinforce the faith in God through miracles that take place whenever there is a need, real or imagined, amongst the people. God's hand is present and tangible in the miracles of the wilderness, but in some instances there is also an element or symbol that requires a more integrated, profound expression of faith that is not based on a visual impression, in preparation for the future mode of guidance of the nation, meaning we understand that Bnei Israel still need these wonders and this visual experience, but we're also trying to shift them to a new mode, a long-term mode, which is not based on the visual and the apparently miraculous. At Marah, where the water is miraculously sweetened, there is a divine command establishing that the nation's survival is dependent upon the fulfillment of God's commandments. God said, or Moshe said, if you will diligently obey the Lord your God and do that which is right in God's eyes and give ear to God's commandments and observe all of God's statutes, all the disease which I put upon Egypt I shall not put upon you, for I am the Lord who heals you. You want to go forward from the afflictions of Egypt, you have to keep the mitzvot. So yes, there was a miracle that was done of the branch which sweetens the waters, but then the lesson that's meant to be learned is the system that mediates our relationship will be truly the system of mitzvot. The instructions accompanying the appearance of the man and the quails, the defined hours when they will be provided, the time they should be gathered, and the quantity that may be taken, develop the people's awareness of God's presence even during the intervals between one miracle and the next. The hours in between the descent of the man and the descent of the quails represent a test of faith in God as the source, who will also provide for their needs the next day and in the days to follow. Right? So there's this transitioning. Again, you have miraculous food coming down from the sky, but you then have to collect it, use it, and wait for the next batch so that you start to develop a sense of faith. You don't need God performing miracles in every moment that you're hungry. In the war against Amalek, Moshe's hands are held up heavenward, indicating that in times of trouble, the people's faith should rest with God. The climax of Moshe's mode of leadership, remember Moshe's mode, that's the signs and the wonders and the visual, comes at the revelation at Sinai. The occasion is based entirely on a sensory experience of seeing the sounds out of which God's words emerge. Right? And the people, the people saw the sounds and the lightning and the sound of the shofar and the mountain smoking. And when the people saw it, they were shaken and stood at a distance. God said to Moshe, so shall you say to Bnei Israel, Atem ri'item, you have seen that I have spoken with you from the heavens. So especially this buttresses Dr. Elitzor's point, because here we see even things that are normally apprehended through the sense of hearing are here apprehended through the sense of sight. So for her, who's setting these things up as in opposition with each other, she's even able to point out here, things that are typically done through sound, through hearing, are done through sight here, because this is the culmination of Moshe's vision of leadership, which is through sight and miraculous visuals. The revelation at Sinai then is the climax of the visual mode of leadership. From this point onwards, now that God's existence has been firmly established before the eyes of all of Israel, the impression of the visual spectacle gradually gives way to a new level of faith that is based on speaking and hearing, a mode that rests upon the experience of the revelation in the past. Okay, so now we're transitioning. We kind of came to our peak. It was never realistic or expected that the visual was going to be permanent mode, but it was done enough to establish an understanding of God's presence and a basis for faith. And now we're going to shift to God's, more long-standing, durable approach, which is, the sense of what's heard. And this explains the command that concludes the description of the revelation. You shall not make with me gods of silver, and gods of gold shall you not make for yourselves. Ibn Ezra, in his short commentary on Sforno, explain. We're going to get quotes from both of them. First, Ibn Ezra. Now that I have spoken with you face to face directly, you have no need to make gods of silver and gold with me. The meaning of the words, shall you not make for yourselves, is, you shall not make other intermediaries with me, for I have no need for you to make gods of gold, and you too have no need, for behold, I have spoken to you directly without any intermediary power between me and you. As the Sforno says, and since you have seen that you have no need for intermediaries in order to draw close to me, you shall not make such as these with me as intermediaries. Right? Part of what they're picking up on is that Hebrew command is lo tasun iti Elohei chesef Elohei zahav lo tasu lachem. Right? And what would it mean to make gods of silver and gold with God? Right? That sounds, one way to read it is it's a prohibition on syncretism. So you can't worship God and also idols made of, silver or gold. Or alternatively, it's actually saying, don't make metal impressions as a way of serving God. That's the with me, the unusual language of et, right? That's what Ibn Ezra and Sforno are picking up on and saying that the prohibition here is not that these were idolatrous, other external gods. They were intermediaries. They were ways of drawing close to God. And God is now saying, you don't need that anymore. If you did ever need it, you don't need that anymore, because now you see that you can access me without any intermediary, right? And the Sforno goes on to say, an altar of earth shall you make unto me. Right, the psukim right there say that. You will likewise have no need to make sanctuaries of silver and gold and precious stones in order that I might draw close to you. An earthen altar will suffice. Okay, interesting in light of the Mishkan, which develops later, but, as she will cite later, there is a very robust debate about whether that was the original plan or not. For the Sforno, it seems like probably that wasn't the original plan. A Mishkan wasn't needed, and an earthen altar would have been enough. But in the wake of the golden calf, etc., it turns out to be needed. But the emphasis here being, we're moving from the visual to the spoken. No intermediaries, no strong visuals are needed anymore, because we've seen God. We can feel that connection now that we can draw on any time. Thus, now that God's existence is engraved upon the hearts of those who saw God's revelation, there's a command to serve God without intermediaries. In between the laws of Parshat Mishpatim, elaborating on the Ten Commandments, and Moshe's ascent of Mount Sinai to receive the tablets, okay, so meaning within Mishpatim, after all those civil laws that describe, flesh out the details of what the Ten Commandments sort of start to point to, the first part of the Parsha, and the end part of the Parsha, which is a recounting of revelation of sorts, there is a description of a new mode of leadership. Okay, these are important psukim. Shemot chapter 23, verses 20 to 23. Hinei anochi sholech malach lefanecha, lishmorcha baderech. Behold, I send an angel before you to watch over you on the way, and to bring you to the place which I have prepared. For my angel will go before you and bring you to the Amori, the Chiti, the Prizi, the Kanani, the Chivi, and the Yebusi, and I will wipe them out. I will annihilate them. Many different views are proposed in the attempt to interpret this new mode of leadership. Now, we're still in Parshat Mishpatim, where we haven't gotten up to Terumah. We're only going to really arrive there at the end of this essay, and it's going to lay the groundwork for what she'll develop further in Parshat Tetzavos. This is a little bit of actually a kind of analysis of the whole first half of the book of Shemot to set up the take on and the framework for the second half of Shemot. So Rashi identifies the angel referred to here as the same one that God announces to Moshe in chapter 33. Right now, we were quoting from Mishpatim, Shemot 23. But now, Rashi says this angel, which God says God is going to send, is the same one that we find out about in Shemot chapter 33, 10 chapters later, following the sin of the golden calf. What do we see there? Shemot chapter 33. God spoke to Moshe, "Depart, go up from here, you and the people that you have brought out of the land of Egypt, to the land which I promised to Avram, to Yitzchak, and Yaakov, saying, I shall give it to your descendants. And I will send an angel before you, and I will drive out the Kanani, the Amori, the Chiti, the Prizi, the Chivi, and the Yevusi. right? So given Rashi's on sound basis because we don't have so many mentions of God sending angels. Here God is saying, I'm going to send an angel before you to drive out the Canaanite peoples. Ostensibly, it makes sense that that's the same angel. Rashi therefore comments on our verse, meaning in Mishpatim, Shemot 23, Behold, I send an angel. Here they are told that they are going to sin, and the divine presence tells them, I will not ascend in your midst. Meaning, right, that angel which God promises in Shemot 33 is in the wake of the sin of the golden calf, when God's saying to Moshe, I've had it with these people. I can't be with them anymore, in an imminent, immediate sort of way. I'm going to have to send an angel to represent me as the people, march forth and go to the land, because I can't tolerate being in their midst. That's what's happening after the sin of the golden calf in Shemot 33. But Rashi on our verse 23 says, when God says, I'm going to send an angel before you, what God's actually saying is not just that, but I'm going to need to send an angel because you're going to sin with the sin of the golden calf, and I'm not going to come along with you, but at that time I will send an angel. This suggestion raises a difficulty, one we might already be thinking about, formulated by Malbim. Behold, I'm sending an angel before you. The commentators are confounded by this verse. This is our verse again in Mishpatim, last week's Parsha, in Shemot 23. And all of the mighty scholars are at a loss to explain it. For Parshat Ki Tisa notes that after the sin of the golden calf, God told Moshe, Depart, go up from here, and I shall send an angel before you and drive out the Canaanite, etc., for I shall not go up in your midst, for you are a stiff-necked nation, lest I devour you on the way. And the nation heard this calamitous news, and they mourned. And Moshe said, if your presence will not be going among us, don't take us up from here. So why does God say also here, after Israel has committed no sin at all, that God will send an angel? Yet they do not mourn, and Moshe does not beseech God at all. Right? So if 10 chapters from now, when that angel is being sent, it seems to be a punishment for wrongdoing and an indication that God can't tolerate residing with the Israelites anymore, and Moshe has to plead with God to change God's mind. That's all in the wake of the sin of the golden calf. Why would God's announcement in Shemot 23 that God's going to send an angel come at all if there was no sin there? And why doesn't Moshe plead for God to change God's mind? Right? The Malbim seems to be assuming these are two different angels, but based on the whole reasoning and narrative of the second, there doesn't seem to be an explanation for why the first one would have been sent. The question that both Ramban and Malbim raise with regards to Rashi's explanation is that if indeed this is the same decree that God made after the golden calf, why is Moshe's objection and supplication as described in Ki Tisa altogether absent from our Parsha? And we could also ask more broadly, why would God be foretelling Bnei Yisrael at this moment, you're going to sin, I'm going to send an angel? It just seems out of place. Abravanel proposes that the decree appointing an angel should be understood as a sort of intermediate stage, as a transition between the divine miraculous mode of leadership that characterized the exodus from Egypt and the revelation at Sinai, and the divine miraculous mode of leadership that would accompany the nation when they entered the land. Moshe raises no objection because this is meant to be a temporary state of affairs, whereas after the sin of the golden calf, God imposes God's decree as an absolute permanent change in God's relationship with the nation. Now we're going to see the quote from the Abravanel, but this is a good potential resolution. In other words, God is saying right after the revelation, okay, you had this intimate relationship of my manifest presence with all these signs and wonders to get you out of Egypt, get you through the sea, get you, settling in the wilderness. Now we're done with that. We're going to have an angel for the wilderness journeys, and don't worry, when you get back into the land, you'll have my more immediate presence. And that sounds fine to Moshe. It's only 10 chapters later, after the sin of the golden calf, when God reiterates that, and the Abravanel has to insert this to make this all make sense. God then says, this is permanent. I actually can't. That originally I was going to send the angel just as like a, transitional stage, but now that I see the way you're behaving, I can't tolerate being with you, and therefore I'm gone, and this angel is going to be the permanent state of affairs. That's what the Abravanel is going to explain in this quote. After telling them the 10 Commandments as general principles and teaching them the mishpatim entailed in them, God said, behold, I send an angel before you, as if to say, You were afraid at my revelation to you in all my glory and might. So you said, let God not speak with us lest we die. And it is indeed proper that you should not think that the supreme closeness to God that you enjoyed at the time of the exodus from Egypt, and at the giving of the Torah, and at this time, will continue constantly through this great and terrible wilderness in which you are journeying. For just as you are unwilling and unable to bear my words, so this wilderness is not able to bear such supreme closeness and my immediate divine guidance. Therefore, behold, I send an angel before you. And this angel was not to lead them forevermore, as other angels lead the other nations. Right? We're familiar with this idea, for example, that the person that Yaakov was wrestling with was Saro Shel Esav, the angel of Esav and the nation of Seir, of Edom, right? So there's an idea that God apportioned out angels, to oversee the other nations, but we get God's self. But not all the time, right? For a little period of time during the wilderness wanderings, we wouldn't have God's immediate presence. We would have that angel. But rather just to watch over you on the way, meaning in the wilderness, so long as they would journey through it, and to bring you to the place which I have prepared, this being the Holy Land, which God had prepared for settling them. Right? Just the backdrop of this question, of this analysis that I think is really worth thinking about and trying to track through the Torah and through all Jewish history. Again, coming back to Rav Yitz Greenberg, who thinks about this very deeply and who has his three eras approach to this, is what is the nature of the presence of God with individuals and then the Jewish people over biblical history and since. We have a lot of data to consider when we try to analyze that question. When are there angels? When is God there? When does God seem close? When does God seem far? Who can access God? What structures and frameworks do we have for connecting with God? And here she's really trying to pick up this analysis through some close readings and noticing that the commentaries are also struggling with this question. Malbim questions this interpretation too. Any discerning scholar will sense the extent to which this explanation is forced. Since God's self, has already performed wonders for them in the wilderness and in Egypt for their forefathers, directly and not through any emissary, why would God now hand them over, even temporarily, to the guidance of an angel? Right? So Abravanel gives this, so we have the questions, why the difference between the angel in chapter 23 and the angel in chapter 33. Abravanel's answer that the angel in chapter 23 was really a temporary state of affairs, and only after the sin of the golden calf did that get switched to a permanent state of affairs. And then we have Malbim's question saying, why would God switch, in Exodus chapter 23, after all this time of getting direct access to God, why would God switch to an angel? Malbim's question concerns the philosophical ramifications of Abravanel's view, which suggests that the change in mode of guidance is meant specifically for the period of journeying in the wilderness. Yet this is the time when the nation is in greatest need of God's presence, like a father to a son who has just been born. How then are we to identify this angel, and why does God announce the appointment of the angel at this particular point in time? Okay, so all this was really developing and building up this question. Now she's going to try to offer more of her own analysis. Setting aside Rashi's view that the angel here is the same one that is decreed in chapter 33 after the sin of the golden calf, we shall adopt Abravanel's view that the role of this angel is to lead the people in a new mode of leadership that replaces miraculous divine revelation with this worldly guidance. Okay, so we're in Parshat Mishpatim. We just had the 10 Commandments, and then the giving of these to Moshe of this set of laws and statutes. And now God says to Moshe, okay, we're done with the immediate, imminent, manifest, mighty presence of God. We're shifting to a more moderate, angel-driven approach. In contrast to Rashi's view of the divine decree as a punishment for the future sin, and in contrast to Abravanel's view, we might present the plan for the leadership by the angel as a replacement for God's direct leadership from this point onwards, to continue even upon entering the land. Abravanel is forced to limit the period of the angel's leadership in order to explain the absence of any protest on Moshe's part. If there is indeed evidence of such a protest, then there is no need to delineate the wilderness journey as a self-contained period in this regard. Okay, so she wants to now say, no, actually God was saying, we're done with that imminent presence. That's not going to be when you get into the land of Canaan either. shifting to the angel, the sort of moderated presence of God or the reduced presence of God for the long term. But then the question is, why doesn't Moshe protest? And so she wants to see if perhaps she can suggest that Moshe does protest. At the end of Parshat Mishpatim, following God's appointment of the angel, Moshe ascends Mount Sinai to receive the tablets. God said to Moshe, "Ascend the mountain to me and be there, and I shall give you the tablets of stone and the Torah and the commandments which I have written to instruct them." And Moshe went into the midst of the cloud, and he ascended the mountain, and Moshe was on the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights. What took place during those 40 days and 40 nights? Rashi maintains that God taught Moshe all 613 commandments while he was atop the mountain. Ibn Ezra and Ramban explain that God was conveying the laws of the Mishkan. And God spoke, right? This is thinking chronological order. We just got Parshat Mishpatim. Then God calls Moshe up onto the mountain. And then we get Parshat Terumah and Tetzaveh. So maybe, as we see in Ibn Ezra and Ramban now, and God spoke. When Moshe ascended to the top of the mountain, at the end of Mishpatim, God spoke to him concerning the Mishkan, the intention being that they should build a sanctuary in honor of God, and God would dwell in it, and there God would speak to Moshe, who would no longer ascend the mountain to hear God's word. Or Ramban, which we're going to see more of in a moment. God therefore commanded first of all concerning the Mishkan, so God would have a house in their midst dedicated to God, and there God would speak to Moshe and command Bnei Yisrael. Ramban elaborates on the reason for commanding the laws of the Mishkan immediately after the revelation at Sinai. This is a relatively famous idea of the Ramban, which it's nice to see inside now. The essence of the Mishkan is that the divine glory which rested upon Mount Sinai should rest upon it in a more concealed form. Right, which rested upon Mount Sinai should rest upon it, the Mishkan, in a more concealed form. As it is written there, and God's glory rested upon Mount Sinai. And it is written, the Lord our God has shown us God's glory and God's greatness. And it is written concerning the Mishkan, and God's glory filled the Mishkan. Twice it is mentioned that God's glory filled the Mishkan, corresponding to God's glory and God's greatness. The Ramban's doing a close reading here, saying when we talked about when the narrator and then Moshe talks about Har Sinai, we're told about God's glory with two languages, God's glory and God's greatness. And then when we talk about the Mishkan, we're told twice God's glory filled the Mishkan. That's a reference to God's glory and God's greatness. So we see a parallelism between the presence of God that was on Har Sinai and the presence of God that's in the Mishkan. This indicates that the glory that had appeared to Bnei Israel at Mount Sinai was always with them, in the Mishkan. And when Moshe would come there, God would speak with him as God spoke to him at Mount Sinai. As it is written concerning the giving of the Torah, from the heavens God made God's voice heard to you, to instruct you, and upon earth God showed you God's great fire. That's Moshe recounting the revelation at Sinai in Devarim. And concerning the Mishkan, it is written, and he heard the voice speak to him from above the covering, from between the two kruvim, and it spoke to him. And the expression spoke to him appears twice, alluding to the teaching in the Kabbalah that the voice emanated from heaven towards Moshe to above the covering of the ark, and from there it would speak to him. For every occasion of speaking with Moshe was from heaven by day, and it emerged from between the two kruvim in the manner described, and you heard God's words from the midst of the fire. Therefore they, the kruvim, were both fashioned from gold. And the text testifies accordingly, where I will meet you and speak to you there, and it shall be sanctified with my glory. For that will be a house of meeting for divine speech, and it shall be sanctified by my glory. So the kruvim, these gold, cherubs with their wings, from the midst of which God's voice speaks, are like the fire of Mount Sinai. And so, as she's about to explain to us, the Ramban is making clear that you can see parallels between the nature of God's presence on Har Sinai and in the Mishkan, because the Mishkan is meant to be a portable Har Sinai, a portable place where God's presence is manifest in the same way that it was at Revelation. According to Ramban, and as evidenced in the parallels that he cites between the descriptions of the Mishkan and the descriptions of God's glory at Mount Sinai, the Mishkan is meant to serve as a sort of portable Sinai. Again, she's not going to delve into, in this essay, why we get all the details of the Mishkan here, but now we at least get a Parshat Terumah, foothold, which is that Terumah introduces the Mishkan. And the Ramban's understanding of the Mishkan is the Mishkan has many parallels to Har Sinai, because it's meant to be a portable Sinai experience, albeit one primarily accessed only through Moshe, but in many ways the Mount Sinai experience was also accessed primarily by Moshe. ensuring the continuation of God's presence over Israel so long as the Mishkan or temple Mikdash exists. This being the case, how is the command, "Let them make me a sanctuary that I may dwell in their midst," to be reconciled with the decree, "Behold, I send an angel before you," that was uttered just one parsha earlier, right? If our take on the Mishkan, if right after Mishpatim, God says, "I'm going to send an angel," and now we're told that right after that, God calls Moshe up and speaks to him on Mount Sinai. And according to Ibn Ezra and Ramban, what God's telling Moshe about on Mount Sinai is the construction of the Mishkan. And the Mishkan, for Ramban, is a portable Sinai, a place where God's presence is as manifest as it was on Har Sinai. Then what's the angel business? We have an ongoing presence of God in the midst of the people. Does the presence of the angel not represent the end of the period of God's direct unmediated guidance and God's constant presence in the Israelite camp in favor of a more worldly mode of guidance that will be led by the angel? That's what we thought it did, but now we get this instruction of the Mishkan, where God's presence is going to be as imminent as at Mount Sinai. It seems logical to posit, okay, that's our big, our leap word. It seems logical to posit that the decree of the angel following the revelation at Sinai is not accepted by Moshe, and that he expresses his protest when he ascends the mountain. There, in the encounter with God, the argument from the burning bush starts up again. But this time the details are not recorded in the text, right? Okay, so this is just a big leap, but, she's compelled by her reading of this ongoing tension, and she's raised all the various questions that have to be dealt with, and nobody has a fully satisfactory way of putting it all together. So here's her way. God says, "I'm going to send an angel." God summons Moshe up on Har Sinai, and Moshe says, "Hold on a second, God. Remember back at the burning bush, you thought speaking was going to be enough. I thought, signs and wonders and visuals were going to be necessary. Now you're telling me that, and you went along with me, but now all of a sudden you're pulling that back, and you're going to the spoken and heard mode with the angel and taking away your presence. I'm not sure the people are ready for that." Right? We may presume now, but again, as she said, we don't get that conversation recorded the way we did at the burning bush, but based on what comes after, we can infer, posit, hypothesize that was going on. We may presume that Moshe's main argument was that the people's faith was still fragile, and that a transition to a natural worldly mode might sabotage that which had already been achieved and blur the momentous impression of the revelation at Sinai. The results of this appeal become apparent at the beginning of our Parashah, where God instructs Moshe in all of the laws of the Mishkan. God has acquiesced to Moshe's request and will allow the nation the continued accompaniment of God's presence for their journey through the wilderness, right? So, how do we get from God saying, "I'm going to send an angel," at the end of Parshat Mishpatim, Moshe goes up on the mountain, and then all of a sudden we start Parshat Terumah, and God's giving instructions for a Mishkan in which God's presence is manifest. We can suggest that in between, Moshe was arguing with God, saying, "Don't send the angel, we need you." And God says, "Okay, build a Mishkan so that you can carry me along, so to speak, with you." The well-known debate as to whether the concept of the Mishkan was intended by God from the outset, or whether it was commanded only as a corrective measure following the sin of the golden calf, takes an interesting turn in light of our discussion. The question rests on the methodological difference of opinion as to whether the Torah's narrative follows the chronological order of events or not. Rashi maintains that the command to build the Mishkan is a result of the sin of the golden calf. Remember, the command to build the Mishkan is in the beginning of our Parsha, Parshat Terumah. Sin of the golden calf is only recorded 2 parshiot later in Ki Tisa. And God gave to Moshe. The Torah does not follow chronological order. The sin of the golden calf preceded the command to build the Mishkan by some time. On the 17th of Tammuz, the tablets were broken, and on Yom Kippur, God was appeased towards Israel. The next day, they began the contributions towards the Mishkan, and it was put up on the 1st of Nisan. Okay, that's Rashi's approach. That, remember, in the rabbinic calendar of this first year after the Exodus from Egypt, and again, it may be, it's certainly based on biblical texts. We just don't have the dates, made explicit in the way that the rabbis do. But we know that Bnei Israel encamped at Har Sinai in the beginning of the 3rd month, Sivan, and we imagined it was just a few days of Moshe going up and prepping with God, and so therefore the revelation happens in the beginning of Sivan, what we now celebrate as Shavuot, and then Moshe's there for 40 days and 40 nights, as Mishpatim, Parshat Mishpatim at the end describes. At the end of that time, and Terumah and Tetzaveh is included in that time, we imagine, and then at the end of that time, again flowing through the chronological order as it's presented in the Torah, is Ki Tisa, and that's when Moshe comes down at the end of those 40 days and 40 nights, sees the golden calf, smashes the luchot, pleads with God for forgiveness, and God then says, okay, build the Mishkan. That's Rashi's approach. Ramban, as we have seen above, argues that the commandment concerning the Mishkan had been intended from the outset. Right? At the end of Parshat Mishpatim, Ramban says, when God summoned Moshe up onto Har Sinai, it was to tell Moshe about the Mishkan. Golden calf hasn't happened yet. Doesn't happen for, another 40 days. And yet the commands for the Mishkan are being given right here at the end of Mishpatim, beginning of Terumah. So again, Ramban, as we have seen above, argues that the commandment concerning the Mishkan had been intended from the outset, and that its appearance in the text corresponds with the chronological sequence of events. We argue here that the command concerning the Mishkan had not been God's original intention, but that it was introduced not as a result of the sin, but rather as a result of Moshe's supplication following God's appointment of the angel. Hence, the command to build the Mishkan in Parshat Terumah appears in its proper chronological place. So she winds up sort of taking a piece of each. For the Ramban, the Mishkan was always the plan, and the the placement of that command is in chronological order. For Rashi, the Mishkan wasn't always the plan; it was a response to the golden calf, and things are not in chronological order. And she says Rashi's right that the Mishkan wasn't always the plan, but Rashi's wrong that it was a response to the sin of the golden calf. It was a response to God saying, "I'm going to send an angel," and Moshe says, "No, the people aren't ready for that. They need your presence." And so God says, "Okay, we'll have a Mishkan." And that happens in chronological order, right there in the end of Parshat Mishpatim. Hence, the command to build the Mishkan in Parshat Terumah appears in its proper chronological place. On the basis of this understanding, that the Mishkan was not God's original intention, and that it was nevertheless commanded prior to the sin of the golden calf, we will try to address the questions that we set forth at the beginning of this shiur, concerning the multiplicity of the details and the laws of its construction. Meaning, now that we have this framework, we're going to use that the Mishkan was a response to God saying, "I'm going to send an angel," Moshe saying, "No, the people need a more immediately accessible way to connect to you and your presence," and God saying, "Okay, you'll get the Mishkan for that." And so the details that are recounted multiple times in Terumah, Tetzaveh, Vayakel, and Pekudei, those details, the multiplicity of the details and the laws of its construction, the repetition in the description of the fulfillment of the command in Vayakel, Pekudei, and the break between the command and the fulfillment with the story of the sin of the golden calf and its results, right? That's what we're going to try to address. All of this will occupy us in the shiur in Parshat Tetzaveh. We're going to address that next week. Okay, so what we hopefully saw here was kind of a recap of a thematic idea which lots of the commentaries seem to pick up on in different ways, which is we see a God who is present through signs and wonders, and especially through the visually perceived manifestations throughout, Shmot, Va'era, Bo, Beshalach, Yitro, and even Mishpatim at the end. And then that ends with God saying, "I'm going to send an angel." So, what does this mean? Maybe it means we're shifting to a different mode. Is that mode permanent? Is that mode temporary? What does that reflect? And she places it in the context of a reading of the burning bush and this whole time that she has offered, which is that Moshe's approach is the signs and wonders. God's approach has always been a gentler, speaking and hearing. God acquiesces to Moshe because of Moshe's, argument of knowing the people, or his sense of what the people will need. And now God is trying to shift it, and Moshe thinks that the people are still not ready. And so Moshe asks God to preserve God's presence. God agrees through the notion of the Mishkan, and then how that reasoning for the Mishkan will inform the many details and their repetition and the placement of the sin of the golden calf in the middle is what we're going to unpack next week. Questions, comments, thoughts? I mean, I think the idea is really interesting, and the way she kind of splits the difference between Rashi and Ramban. I certainly always prefer if things can be in chronological order in the Torah, and I think it makes for a smooth reading. Of course, the bump is that we have to accept her premise about this debate between God and Moshe, and the premise that essential conversation happens. It's just off script, and we don't see it recorded in the Torah. Again, plausible, possible,
Makes good
certainly
sense.
not able to be confirmed. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Peter, go ahead.
I have a question. Kind of a historical thing. We have a list of nations, Canaanite nations that are being displaced, but one nation is not mentioned at all. Philistines. Were they already in place in the area of Gaza, Ashkelon, or perhaps they weren't there yet? Why aren't they mentioned if they were
Mm,
in presence? They gave us a lot of problems for
yeah,
hundreds of years.
yeah, yeah,
Why were
yeah,
they not eliminated for us?
yeah, yeah. That's a great question. Just taking a moment to search. Hold on a second. Yeah, it's a really good question. Just looking to see where the Plishtim are mentioned. Not even sure that they're mentioned. They're certainly mentioned many times in Breshit, and
Right.
the geography is mentioned in Shmot, but the nation, the Philistine people, is really not mentioned from Breshit 26, on um, until the book of Joshua. It's not clear to me.
I mean, maybe they were just getting established.
Right,
It take
right,
a couple of generations
right,
before
right.
they built up.
What I vaguely recollect from my masters in Bible is that they were a seafaring people that came
Yes,
from elsewhere.
from Greek islands, one of the Greek
Exactly,
islands.
exactly. How might that have impacted God's vision of what when they were going to be conquered, or how they fit into the Canaanite nations? It's a good question. I
Because they
imagine
were,
biblical scholars have written about this, and I just don't have it at my
yeah,
fingertips.
because they were eliminated much later, actually by Romans, were
Mm-hmm.
able to totally extinguish them. But they
Mm-hmm.
gave us a lot of trouble
Yeah.
over hundreds of years.
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
just and another little corollary, maybe a silly question. When Moshe was in discourse with God at the burning bush, and he had this excuse that he's slow of speech, Hashem couldn't just wave his hand and institute a miracle. I mean, so many bigger miracles and take away that problem. Which, but I kind of an explanation on that. Maybe he wanted Moshe to fix his own problem, which he did
Right.
over the years. He was a very good speaker later on, but
Yeah.
it could have eliminated that
Yeah.
uh,
Yes.
particular question very quickly and instantly. So I just wondered, all powerful God
Yes.
took that as an excuse, or allowed that to be an excuse. That's
Yeah.
kind of strange.
Yeah. Yeah.
Anyway, just
I have generally understood it in that way, that it was about giving Moshe the opportunity to transcend his own challenges, or to recognize his limitations, and thereby, develop his relationship with his brother Aharon. Um, and the kind of reluctant or flawed or challenged leader model is what the Torah wants us to focus on. Um, but I do think it's an interesting question. The Ramban, actually, apropos of the Ramban comments, and we could raise many challenges to this, but that the Torah looks to minimize miracles only to the absolute essential. Right? He comments
Okay.
this all the way back in Parshat Noach, wonderful Ramban, where he says, like, why did the ark have to be so big? First of all, it probably still couldn't have fit all the animals in that size. So why not just make it 1 cubit by 1 cubit by 1 cubit, and God
Uh,
miraculously fits all the animals? And he said,
yeah.
that's not the way of the Torah. We
Yes.
we want things, we want to minimize miracles. So we could maybe apply that principle to this question as well.
Right. Right. And if I may just make one more comment
Of
about the
course.
angels. The Kruvim are in fact angels. So could that could that play into that idea of angels were there, and they certainly a representation of the golden angels, the Kruvim.
Hmm.
Hashem spoke, so they were kind of there. Wouldn't that count as angels being there as well?
That's a really interesting question. I have not seen that particular interpretation, meaning that the Kruvim were angelic type figures. Yes,
Yes.
whether that's a suggested, and I'm sure that some must have made that connection. Although I guess I imagine, I guess two possible small picking, at your suggestion. The malach is in singular, whereas the Kruvim are two. And
Two,
I
yeah.
think we somehow imagine the Malach as more dynamic, than the Kruvim, which are, which are inanimate in a sense. But I think it's an interesting suggestion. I like connecting them.
Yeah.
Great, great. Thank you, Peter. We're coming to Lance and then Bracha.
Oh, but Lance probably has much better explanation.
Um, I have a thought that's really not related to what we've just been talking about, but it's something that I see through my lens as a literary critic or professor of literature, whatever you want to call me, and that is the journey, the trip. And if you look at the what we're talking about now, with the angel leading and the Mishkan, the portable Mishkan, it reminded me of the Noah's Ark, which you mentioned just a few
Mm-hmm,
minutes ago.
mm-hmm,
And I was
mm-hmm.
thinking about that. And if you think about it, I believe that God gives Noah directions for building the ark, doesn't he? But
Yeah.
they're not, are they, how much do we know about those directions? Not
Yeah.
like what we see here, is it?
No,
Well,
nowhere
the
near as
size is
elaborate.
given,
Right, the size is given, the number of floors,
floors,
and the sloped roof, but that's it.
windows, and all
Right,
Yeah,
that. Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
right.
yeah.
And the other thing that has always fascinated me is that in Genesis, God plagues the Pharaoh, I think, in one line, and in Exodus, it's a lot of lines, but it's the same thing basically. It's plagues, and it seems to me that there is something going on here that I would call recursion. It's like figura fulfillment for in Mimesis, Eric Auerbach, and there's a sense in which we've got all these journeys going on. My favorite of all is Joseph. I mean, I love Joseph. I think that's the best narrative in the whole Torah. But uh, it's the question is here we have something that's being repeated in effect, structurally very different, but it's being repeated again and again and again. And my guess is, just a guess, that in ancient times, perhaps even today, one of the main entertainments is the journey, and people wanted to hear about journeys.
Mm-hmm.
And I
Yeah.
would think that that would be a motivating factor for what's going on here, which unfortunately undermines and subverts the whole religious thing, but and makes it fiction. But that doesn't necessarily mean there's no God or higher force, though.
Yeah.
But the Mishkan, it seems to me, and I never really thought about this, never put this together until just now, is an analog for the Ark. And you have Moses Teva, where Moses in his little journey is in this box or whatever on it, and it reminds me of Moby Dick when at the very end of Moby Dick, Ishmael is floating around in a box and um, Rachel saves him, which is kind of cool anyway. But so
I
what
just
I'm
read
trying to
Moby
say
Dick.
is there is a literary theme or structure that's going on here. And my favorite angel in the Torah is one that you probably would never connect with the angel we're talking about here now. That's the angel in Numbers 22. What angel is that?
Um, is that in Bilam's story?
Yep, yep, that's it. And the angel there is connected with Satan, actually. Satan is an obstacle, and the name Satan is not a devil like in Christianity, but clearly the angel stands there, and only the donkey can see the angel initially. I think maybe even altogether. And Balaam can't see it. And the donkey and Balaam get together, and they have this whole thing. And it seems to me that this is, Hamakom. These are the sacred places of God,
Hmm,
and I think it's all related, but literally, but as a fiction.
beautiful. Great insights. I love the idea of the journeys. And before I come to bracha, just noticing Ruth's comments in the chat. Also wondering why no mention of how we were going back home to the place where our ancestors Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov lived doesn't get mentioned in many or most of these passages. Yeah, yeah. It certainly figures in a bunch of them, but not always. And regarding speech, maybe it was to help develop an alliance with his brother, and also with Moshe, with his brother Aaron, and get us ready for working with and appreciating other leaders we may have in later generations, right? The sense of the need for collaboration and leadership. Um, and I think that's great. And at times we may need both angels and a more direct connection with Hashem. Yeah, some of the angels are there for particular projects. Yeah, great, great. Bracha, go ahead.
Yes, I guess there are two things. One is I'm thinking about what was said in terms of the question about not miraculously solving Moshe's speech problem. And I'm thinking that maybe it was meant to give him more of an understanding of the people and their being flawed.
Mm-hmm.
Didness that way. So that's
Yeah.
in terms of that. And then also thinking about the transition from the visual spectacle to hearing, that I think one reason that hearing is on a higher level is because our total experience with hearing up until then, in terms of the slavery experience, was being told what to do. It was very harsh. And to be able to see it as something that's uplifting is a really transcendent moment.
Yeah. Yeah. Beautiful. Beautiful. Thank you. Um, great. 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 Ruth, yep, a quick comment.
I also think I wish people appreciated the details of Terumah more. And I love Terumah. It was my first parsha that I read, except for Eicha, actually, that I ever learned to read. But I also, isn't there an element where, like, not just a bad part, like a punishment, but also maybe Hashem realized that people wanted to be involved in being close to Him, and had to do something themselves. And when we were helped to build the Mishkan, it was from their own free will offerings the first time, but it also made certain things possible, because of the dwelling within being like the covenantal part, that it wasn't just imposed from above. So in a way, like almost comforting us that what we didn't and helping us with the relationship with him after some pretty scary stuff that we never talk about, which happened before that. But who was left of us, he gave us a way to connect, and not only the mission of what we had to fight for, but also a mission of where we would sit down, where we would eat, where he would be honored in some way. And I think there is a big human need, and how to do it not idolatrously. That a huge thing we're definitely working on. So I just wanted to mention that.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, well said. And yes, there's so, even though the Torah here and Dr. Elitzor's reading, is describing a process from thousands of years ago, it still feels very relevant today in terms of our needs for connection, for a sense of God's presence, for a sense of the presence of God's messengers. All of these things are ongoing processes as we continue to face so many challenges and still developing our own religious sensibilities, person by person, generation by generation, community by community. Yeah. Thank you.
I forgot my critical comment, because I do like Ravavi, and like you always think of in terms of problem solving.
Yes.
But what the second temple was built with, and the second time round, there was a lot of conscription, as much free will, and we've been having a lot of trouble, ever since. I think so. There's something very beautiful in that first, trying to get that, rebuild the Ohel, not just in the Mishkan, not only the temple.
Yeah.
Process.
Beautiful. Yeah. Great. All right, everybody. As usual, I'll just jump to my calendar to make sure we're on schedule for next week, which I believe we are. And that's Monday the 23rd. Yep. Look forward to learning together then as we really pick up what's kind of part 2 of the essay we did this week. So looking forward to that. Take care, everybody. Great rest of the week.
Thank you very
Love
much.
Good night to all.
Laila Tov.
Laila Tov.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Sure thing. Bye.